In Scotland, one of the nation's best-known whisky makers has built a new distillery. Dropped into the hillside above the River Spey, it's unlike any other. It could be a structure from the Cold War, or something out of James Bond. A year after it was opened, it's become a stop on the tourist trail, and not just for the whisky. The competition to design this most unusual of distilleries was won by the London-based partnership of Richard Rogers, Graham Stirk and Ivan Harbour. And to Graham Stirk fell the task of reimagining an age-old process for the 21st century.
The whole point was the mystery revealed. Suddenly this distillery pops up, and the mystery revealed was why we were very interested in. The word we used in the presentation was, this is Jules Verne. This is something where you find a piece of almost Victorian engineering buried and still functioning below ground. And it was the contrast of the two which was actually really, really important.
Few architects can afford to work in a building they designed. Graham Stirk does. His office is in Leadenhall Street in the City of London, in the building affectionately known as the Cheese Grater, which sprang from his drawing board in 2000 and cost its developers £340 million. From his desk he can see and almost touch the Lloyd's headquarters, on which he worked over 30 years ago, when he first joined Richard Rogers, the architect who gave the world the Pompidou Centre. The Lloyd's building is still a source of wonder to him.
When I joined, Lloyd's of London was a hole in the ground. They'd done Pompidou, so and it's interesting. Coming out of college and then finding yourself on something like that. I mean, maybe some people are cooler than I, but I found it. God, I found it terrifying, and it's all pre-computer as well. Lloyd's of London, so it's all hand-drawn. Trying to find your way around it. The first year, I learnt a great deal.
Graham Stirk came to work for Richard Rogers in 1983, rapidly became a director, and in 2007, Rogers changed the name of his practice to reflect Stirk and Ivan Harbour's contribution to the business. There's a name and a reputation to live up to, which means there's pressure in Graham Stirk's everyday life, though you would hardly know it. With his team, he's become used to drawing buildings which are complex, not only in their appearance, but also in the way they work. And over the years, he's adjusted his mind to design at scale, something not all architects achieve. Size marks out his buildings, and may have influenced the Scottish whisky giant Macallan when it chose him to design a new distillery and visitor experience on their site in northeast Scotland, Speyside, the spiritual home of the many firms, big and small, which produce what Scots like to call the water of life. But first, there was a competition to be won, which meant a crash course in the mechanics of whisky production.
I found it fascinating when, what does this equipment look like? So we were Googling what the equipment was like. We were trying, so we got all the stills wrong, the wrong shapes in the first one. What? And then saying, we were trying to understand what this equipment was, and then we realised as well at the competition, we knew it wasn't going to be a modern art gallery. It wasn't going to be this beautiful, cool space with a few beautiful stills sat within it. It's an industrial production. And at that time, this idea of moving it into a big rectangular building was circular. Each circle represents what is required to make 5 million litres of whisky a year. And so we decided in terms of the legibility that each would then represent something that would inform the bulge in the roof. I suppose the artistry is, it's not all the same. Where does one enter the building? And which is why when they roll and then one goes higher to signal the entrance.
Graham Sturck's first sketches included a diagram that showed the component parts of production. Then came a series of sketches of the humped roofs that would eventually sit above the whisky-producing stills. The sketch was inputted to a computer and refined into a wire diagram modelling not only the overall shape, but also the individual squares that would make up the roof, squares which would contain vegetation to help it blend into the landscape. And the wire diagram, a 2D image on a screen, was turned into a physical model so that the team could get up close and personal with the spaces they were designing. But through all the iterations of the design, from plans to technical drawings, the scheme never moved far from Graham Sturck's first sketch.
Graham Sturck kind of hit it on the head. He got the lie of the land right, he got sympathy with the environment it was in, and he came up with some really interesting ideas, from the roof to the visitor centre being part of the whole building, and that kind of symbiosis of brand and operations was really, really well understood. He kind of got the hard wire. Two things inspired us: the design and the concept as presented, and Graham himself. The passion. He's quite a quiet and reserved individual, but the passion came out of him when he presented this wonderful concept. And actually, what we've got in reality is not too far removed from the original concept that was presented in 2012.
It's a thing that sometimes we use. It begins as a diagram, but the diagram, you can't start with a diagram and just follow logical processes and arrive at a building. You have to test the architectural possibilities of how something can resolve the complexity of this problem elegantly and begin to give meaning and drama to the process that's taking place within it. In this particular instance, you have to artificially accelerate where a building may head, because you need to create visual images. We used to do it with evocative sketches. It's difficult to hide or to keep loose, especially with our form of architecture. It's not something you just say, that's the image. you know, these things take an awful lot of evolution.
There's a marked difference between designing for the City of London and designing for the countryside of Scotland. Graham Stirk didn't immediately walk the site, but thinking about it from his desk in London, he realised that his building must complement the surrounding hills, blend in, ideally sink in, though his team knew that would be expensive.
I prefer to test ideas and then view something, mainly because it's so possible to be able to explore things through terrain, relationships. The idea of making it part of the landscape was, which form of architecture do we derive? If we were in an open field or in a valley as a standalone building, you could create something that sits as a very beautiful contrast to that. This had a backdrop of a whole series of maturation facility buildings which basically hold much of the spirit for 10 years minimum. And then you had a small village adjacent to it, which is the existing facility, which has its utilitarian components and the older maturation sheds. What form of architecture do you introduce? So our view was to make something which was of a landscape, but very clearly a man-made landscape.
Whether in London or here, we met him and the ideas would just come rolling out and he'd draw them down and nothing is discarded. He keeps all the drawings and they're in a book actually, many of these sketches he did, and they became part of the process. So he has a talent, there's no doubt about that is terrific to watch. But as an engineer myself, what I was impressed by Graham and his team is they understood the practicalities of what they were doing. Can you build it? Can you make it? It gave our construction team some real challenges, to be perfectly honest, but they got through it and they got through it together. And if it didn't work, they'd tweak it and change the design as they went along. But fundamentally, the team were terrific. It was a great experience over 39 months of a build. Yeah.
Though the new distillery would be sunk into the hillside, its roof would be there for all to see. It would take its cue from the surrounding hills, and it would be a good example of something architects often talk about: form following function.
The roof is the response to the landscape. It is deliberately rotational in its form, which is a reflection of the arrangement, the very particular arrangement of the production equipment that we laid out in these repetitive cells. It's also very much a system, so the accentuation over the visitor experience obviously gives you that slightly cathedral-like space as a visitor, particularly when you move into from the compression of the entrance out into the visitor experience. And then the notion of this sort of exhibition space here, the roof geometry flattens out, and the idea is that it's an extrusion. In theory, it could keep going. It's no longer a response to the production equipment that is happening underneath. So yeah, it's a localised. It's an approach and a response to the activities that are happening beneath. We don't have a fermentation room and a still room. We have a cell of production that collectively produces 5 million litres of spirit. That can then be replicated numerous times. Once there was a decision to want to respond sensitively in this location, the essence of a concept, I think, began to form.
Graham Stirk's design was so radically different from anything on Speyside, where most distilleries have grown up organically and operate on a small scale, that there was a question mark over whether Macallan would be prepared to invest the money required to realise it. And if the answer was yes, would they stay the course over 4 years of construction, footing the bill for the smart interior whose details the architect and his team believed were as important as the exterior?
My mantra was, we cannot remove the design intent. Regardless of the pressures we're under, and there's always budgetary pressures in these kind of projects, and companies go down and you've got to change a supplier. The design intent was fundamental. We had to deliver the wow factor that we were trying to deliver from the very outset. So yeah, we had to hold the line, we had to work together, we had to compromise and agree a way forward, and it was a very refreshing experience.